Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as John gives us a perspective on the potential for reducing weed pressure and herbicide input when using cover crops. My name is Odine Alvarez, and I'm a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute. And my colleagues Shannon Muller with the Soil Health Institute and Olivia Cayuet with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture are also on the call providing technical support. We three support the education component of Farmers for Soil Health. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide you all with insight into practical and research-based strategies farmers and conservation professionals can use to reduce weed pressure and improve a system resilience when using cover crops. Today's webinar is supported by Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH. The initiative is one of many USDA-funded advancing markets for producers projects. FSH is a collaborative initiative of commodities organizations, the United Soybean Board, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Pork Board, with a goal to increase cover crop adoption. This specific project provides an incentive to farmers who are new to planting cover crops or who have been planting cover crops for many years. State-level commodity organizations and conservation professionals work across 20 states, stretching from the Dakotas to the East Coast to provide local technical assistance and outreach programming. FSH has also developed a website full of resources and information. You can learn more about FSH at farmersforsoilhealth.com. Lastly, a few items about today's event. This presentation is being recorded and an email will be sent with a link to the webinar recording posted to the Center for Regenerative Agriculture YouTube channel, along with final feedback for survey. And then we'll end with a Q&A moderated by Olivia. So as questions come up, please put them in the Q&A. You can upvote questions that you'd like to prioritize as we cover them live. If you run into any technical issues, please don't hesitate to chat the webinar co-host as we will work to resolve any issues. If you'd like captions on, those can be enabled by clicking the three dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions. Be sure to hang on till the end for information related to the Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit for attending this webinar. And with that being said, I am excited to welcome our guest, John Wallace. Dr. John Wallace, I'll let you introduce yourself and take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Odine. I'm excited to be here. My name's John Wallace. I'm an extension weed management specialist based at Penn State. I work in field crops, so kind of grain crop production systems as well as dairy cropping systems here in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to talk today about utilizing cover crops as a form of weed control and to increase weed suppression potential in cropping systems. And that's a big topic that we could spend a lot of time on. I'm going to try to zero in today on the potential for utilizing cover crops in your system to reduce herbicide inputs. And that's an important topic today, given kind of the farm economy and low commodity prices and high input prices. And the simple answer as to whether we could use cover crops to reduce herbicide inputs is it depends. It depends on a number of factors. It depends really on cover crop performance, so how well we can establish a uniform stand of cover crops, and how much biomass we can produce to aid weed suppression. That's really constrained by a number of factors. Crop rotations constrain that, soil and environment gradients, as we kind of move across the country, will really influence the performance potential of cover crops and therefore weed suppression. And then it also depends on the nature of your weed management challenges. And this day and age, the first thing we turn to is to ask whether you have herbicide-resistant weed species present. And oftentimes, weed species that are resistant to multiple herbicides or sites of action. And that will also really constrain or determine what the potential is for reducing herbicide inputs. So given that there's so many kind of context dependent factors that influence this question, I'm going to try to um, not really drill down into specifics about cover crop management practices for a given system or any one weed species, but just pose kind of a framework for thinking about how to make decisions about herbicide inputs and some questions that a farmer might ask, or an advisor, certified crop advisor, or agronomist might help a farmer work through when they're deciding how they could potentially change their herbicide inputs or their herbicide programs. So apologize for the same numbers there. That was kind of a little error in the transfer of the PowerPoint. So when I think about reducing weed control costs, and specifically how we can utilize cover crops to do that, there's a couple things that you could consider or should be considered. One is we may be able to reduce the number of application passes in our herbicide program. And so that would come at both a labor and energy savings that goes into your total herbicide uh, program costs. Another way we could think about reducing herbicide inputs is to reduce the total number of herbicide active ingredients that we use to control weeds in any given season. So we may have one or two or three pass herbicide programs, and each time we go out with a sprayer, we might have two to three or four or five different herbicide active ingredients in the tank. They each have a specific job, a weed control spectrum, or we're trying to lengthen the activity of weed control. And so we may ask how cover crops can help us reduce the number of active ingredients that we need to get good weed control over the course of a growing season. And then the last one I think is important to consider is that weeds, when we think about weed control, we have to think long term, because weeds that aren't controlled this year add seeds to the weed seed bank and potentially contribute to a bigger problem in future years. So another way to think about cover crops and herbicide inputs is that we may use cover crops to really maintain and not have to increase our herbicide program inputs by reducing the risk of weed control failures. Because when we have weed control failures, that means that we have more a higher kind of density of weeds and number of weed species in our seed bank, and that's going to contribute to potentially more herbicide inputs in the future. So I'm going to, before I get to those specific points that I want to walk through or considerations, I thought it would be useful to just get everybody on the same page as far as how we think about herbicide programs in kind of conventional no-till production systems across the U.S. And we often you'll hear extension lead specialists like myself, or industry or agronomists talk about two different types of weed control objectives or goals. One is the crop protection mindset, where we're trying to use herbicides to control weeds early in the growing season, where we often is really when we see the greatest level of competition with weeds and we can lose crop yields, up until a point in which we no longer would lose yield once weeds emerge. And so you may hear that referred to as kind of a crop protection mindset, or a critical period of weed control that we're trying to shoot for. And in corn or soybeans, a general rule of thumb, at least in the mid-Atlantic, is that we need really good weed control for at least 5 to 6 weeks from the beginning of that planting that crop into the crop growing season. And if we do that, we typically think that we've pretty much maintained weed control through that critical weed period. And any weeds that emerge after that may survive and reproduce and produce seed, but they're not impacting crop yields. Another thing that we often hear about today is a zero seed rain management goal, where the goal is to control weeds really throughout the growing season to really eliminate or significantly reduce the potential of weed seed rain. So we don't want any weeds going to seed to really try to uh, decrease weed seed banks over the long term. We often hear about this weed management goal in the context of some of these really troublesome multiple herbicide resistant weed species like Palmer amaranth or water hemp or several others. So those are the two kind of management goals when we think about how we position herbicide programs and herbicide inputs, and it's really about the length of weed control that we're trying to get. And so then you'll also hear about kind of the herbicide program being designed by as either a one or a two pass or perhaps a three pass herbicide program to meet those goals, whether it's a crop protection goal or a zero seed rain management goal. And so when we think about two pass herbicide programs, we're generally talking about applying herbicides at or near planting, and we're applying soil residual herbicides, what we would call pre's, that provide weed control for several weeks early in that growing season. So they're controlling weeds as they emerge. And so that would be the first pass. And then in a two pass program, let me go back. So the idea is that we would control weeds for several weeks, and then in a two pass program come in with foliar active herbicides in that second pass to control any weed escapes. So as those soil residuals start to decline or their activity declines in the soil, we might see some weed escapes, and we're cleaning those up with a post herbicide. Now, if that post program only contains herbicides that are foliar active and don't provide any residual activity in the soil, then we risk having some additional weed escapes occur, depending on what weed species we're dealing with, depending on the weather that might influence weed emergence patterns. So here's an example. This is a picture taken in about V7 corn. Um, this particular field used a two-pass herbicide program. They used a pre-emergent herbicide, and then they applied a post at about the V4 growth stage. But that post application didn't contain any soil or residual herbicides, and so you see some water hemp escapes there. Um, that corn is going to start to canopy pretty quickly and suppress those water hemp plants, but those water hemp plants will probably still produce seed and contribute to the weed seed bank. And so that's where we also hear about additional herbicide inputs into past programs, where we include additional herbicide active ingredients in that post-pass that contain soil residual activity. We call that a layered residual program. And that layered residual program is really used when you have a zero seed rain management goal. So you would come in that second pass, clean up those escapes, but you would also then control any of those later escapes that might occur to really drive down uh, weed seed rain in that given year. So that's kind of when we think about herbicide inputs, we're thinking about the number of passes, whether we're using a two-pass herbicide program, we're applying pre's at planting and post herbicides, and then the number of active ingredients in both of those passes. Okay, and so that's just to finish that up. The zero seed rain management goal is to really prevent situations like this. And so we had a lot of escapes occur in this soybean field. What you're looking at is water hemp, and you're going to have a really tremendous seed rain event this year in soybeans, and that's going to contribute to kind of a long-term management challenge within this field. Okay, so how do we think about cover crops in the context of these types of herbicide programs and herbicide inputs? So the first thing that I would do is to ask whether we can use cover crops to substitute for pre-emergent herbicides. And so the context of this is that we're in a no-till production system, and we're planting cover crops, a winter hardy cover crop like cereal rye or triticale. If you're going to corn, perhaps there's a window to fit legumes in with those grasses as well. And we would be generating some biomass in the spring from those cover crops and leaving those cover crops on the surface to create a weed suppressive mulch. And so that weed suppressive mulch that we can produce by allowing cover crops to grow through the spring and get big and terminating them and leaving them on the surface um, suppresses weeds as they're emerging early in the growing season. So there's some kind of overlapping mechanism that's comparable to using pre-emergent herbicides. So there is an opportunity to substitute cover crop surface mulch for those pre-herbicides, or at least some of those pre-herbicides. And whether um, that's a potential fit in your system, the first thing I would ask is, um, do you have enough cover crop performance or enough biomass production where you can be spraying fewer weeds in that post-emergence pass because of those cover crops? And so the picture that you're seeing is a soybean field where they didn't use a pre-herbicide. There is no cover crop. And you can see the amount of pressure that's occurred. They've already lost yield in this situation. And when they spray that water hemp that's in that soybean field, they're going to see reduced levels of efficacy with the post-emergence application because of how dense that weed infestation is. And so the goal for using cover crop surface mulches for early season weed suppression is to reduce the recruitment of those weeds early in the growing season to reduce competition with crops and then also allow you to be effective with post herbicides. Another question that I like to talk to growers about or crop advisors about is we have to also make sure that we're using cover crops in a way that keep us on target with our post-emergence herbicides. So often when we see failed control with post herbicides, it's because we're out there spraying weeds when they're too big. And so we have a kind of a rule of thumb that we talk about. Broadly speaking, post-emergence herbicides are going to be more effective when we're targeting weeds that are below 4 inches tall. And so we talk about the soda can rule, right? Are those weeds smaller than a soda can? And so cover crops can impact kind of early season growth rates of weeds as well. One of the things that cover crop residues might do is not necessarily reduce whether or prevent weeds from emerging from the soil, but they may delay their emergence. And if they delay their emergence, then those weeds might take a little longer to progress through those stages and create a longer window for you to really stay on target with post herbicides. So we want to spray smaller weeds. We think, cover crops can be a tool to really lengthen the window, which allows you to stay on target and spray small weeds. And we've done, probably for the last, here at Penn State, we've been doing this for 10 or 12 years now, kind of asking those types of questions in the context of our production systems. And so I'm just sharing a little bit of data to support what I just suggested. So on the left, what we were doing, we're comparing a hairy vetch and cereal rye cover crop planted after soybean and before field corn. We're comparing that to a no cover crop control. We just killed those cover crops and didn't use pre-emergent herbicides in this figure. And you can see the reduction in weed density, specifically pigweeds, in this case, compared to the no cover crop control about 7 weeks, or I'm sorry, 5 weeks after planting. And so we see about a 50 to 60% reduction in weed density. And we've seen those types of outcomes in a number of studies, I would say broadly across kind of production regions, that a well-established cover crop that produces, probably at least 2 tons of dry matter biomass per acre you can expect to see somewhere around 50% reduction in weed populations. On the right, what we did in this study was also measured those heights of the pigweeds at the time of that post application. And you can see that when we had the cover crop present, we really constrained that population to individuals that were below 3 inches. And the majority of the individuals are really below an inch or about an inch tall. And that had to do with kind of delayed germination and reduced growth rates due to that cover crop competition. In comparison to when we had no cover crop, we had a proportion of that population out there that were really off target. They were too big, and that was going to probably affect efficacy depending on what our post program was. This is just from the same study to kind of ask this question about the opportunity for substituting cover crops for pre-herbicides. And what we found was if we're thinking about the number of passes and reducing the number of passes, the combination of cover crops and just a post program resulted in about the same level of season-long weed control as a two-pass herbicide program without cover crops. So that's what this figure is showing. We have the herbicide program on the bottom, just a single pass post program compared to a two-pass program. And you have the cover crop treatment in the green and the control in the yellow. And you can see that with a cover crop and a post herbicide program, we had about the equivalent level of weed control, season-long weed control, as a two-pass herbicide program. So there are opportunities. Every system is going to be a little bit different. Again, it's about kind of cover crop performance, biomass potential. It's also about what type of weed species you have, how large of weed seed banks you're dealing with. But there's certainly an opportunity to think about reducing pre-inputs when you can achieve good cover crop performance and create that surface mulch. Getting to that second question that I raised or factor that I raised and asking whether we can use cover crops to just reduce the number of active ingredients in our program. And so again, I think the opportunity for reducing AIs is really in the form of those pre-emergent or soil residual herbicides. When we're out there applying post-emergence herbicides, we really want a good, effective program, often with 2 effective sites of action. We would recommend because we're really trying to, that's our last opportunity to get control and is really going to influence survival rates and seed banks in the future. So when you're thinking about opportunities for reducing pre-emergent or soil residual herbicides, the first thing I would ask is, do you have herbicides in your herbicide program that have a similar weed control spectrum as the cover crop? And so what is the weed control spectrum of cover crops? So when we're talking about cover crop surface mulch, most of our work has been done with grass cover crops like cereal rye or triticale, but this is kind of broadly applicable to whether you're using cover crop mixtures as well, and really a function of a biomass production. And so the figure on the right that you're seeing is how seedling survival differs as a function of the weed seed size. And the way that we describe the weed seed size in this figure is weed seed mass as a ratio relative to crop seed mass. And so we have smaller seeded species on the left to larger seeded species on the right. And this is the survival rate of those weeds in 1.5 tons of dry matter biomass per acre of a cereal rye surface mulch. And so what you'll find, and what this data and lots of other supporting literature in the weed ecology literature would suggest is that cover crops are really the most effective on small seeded broadleaf weed species. And Palmer amaranth and water hemp and horseweed and a few others are really troublesome weed species in no-till systems because they produce a lot of seed, but those seeds individually are very small, and so they're susceptible to that cover crop surface mulch. and we can gain pretty high levels of weed suppression for those types of species. But there's some larger seeded broadleaf species that we deal with. One example that we deal with in the Mid-Atlantic is burr cucumber, which is very large seeded. It's about half the size of a soybean seed. Those types of species tend to produce fewer seeds per plant, but each seed is much larger. And so they tend to have the ability to germinate without light presence. They can germinate from deeper in the soil profile because they have enough energy stored in that seed to grow out of that surface mulch and survive. And so there is a weed control spectrum related to cover crops. And it's really, most effective cover crop surface mulches are most effective on small seeded species. So just to illustrate that, here's a picture from the field. I like using this picture. It's a really zoomed in picture of a water hemp seedling trying to emerge out of a cereal rye surface mulch. And you can see it started somewhere down here and is now very etiolated, producing a really long shoot because it's trying to get out of that surface mulch and grow towards the sunlight. Um, and so that's oftentimes a seedling like that won't survive even after it germinates because it just doesn't have enough reserves in that seed to establish and start to photosynthesize. In comparison, here's just a picture of some greenhouse work that a graduate student of mine did that demonstrates that though larger seeded broadleaf species can emerge from kind of pretty significant levels of cover crop surface mulch, it does come at a cost. And so what you're seeing is a velvet leaf plant, and you can see the roots and the shoots and the amount of biomass production across a cereal rye surface mulch gradient from 1.5 tons to 4.5 tons of dry matter per acre. And so the velvet leaf that had to grow through a lot of mulch had to spend a lot of its energy on that shoot to get out of the mulch, and that came at a cost of root production. And so when we think about utilizing cover crops to set up post programs, I would suspect that a post program might be more effective on a plant like this, or that plant may be less competitive with cash crops as well, because it had to reduce its root production to establish. Okay, so I just wanted to add one more note on thinking about opportunities for reducing pre-herbicide inputs and active ingredients in your spray program. One of the things that we're finding as we start to investigate kind of integrated weed management strategies with cover crop surface mulch and how we fit different herbicide programs together is that the more cover crop biomass we produce, the greater amount of pre-emergent herbicide is intercepted in that residue and doesn't become available in the soil profile to control weeds. So we need pre-emergent herbicides with soil residual activity to get to the soil surface and activated by rainfall to be effective at weed control. And so when we have more cover crop surface residues on biomass on the surface, we see reduced amounts of those herbicides in the soil. And our work suggests that some herbicides, depending on their properties, do a better job or have a greater potential of washing off of cover crop residues and eventually becoming available in that soil profile for weed control. And so that's something that there's a lot of active work on right now. And we're continuing to work on that, and you should expect to see some best management practices developed for herbicide selection, for selecting herbicides that are more compatible with these high residue cover crop systems because of their wash off properties and ability to get washed off and incorporated into that soil profile. Okay, so finally, just thinking about pricing in the risk of weed control failure. So I just walked through briefly what I think are kind of the opportunities for reducing herbicide inputs. mostly focused on reducing either a pre-emergent pass or the number of active ingredients in those programs. However, if you're in a system that's dealing with species like you see on the right, like water hemp, that are really persistent challenges from a weed control standpoint due to multiple resistance, that have high weed seed banks and are really a long-term challenge. Um, Perhaps the goal should then be to use cover crops in a way that doesn't require the need for more herbicide inputs in the future. So can we maintain our effective herbicide program, sustainably into the future by integrating cover crops into our system? And I think that's an important and perhaps kind of overlooked part of kind of cover cropping and its role in herbicide programs, because suboptimal weather can really lead to herbicide failures, whether that's pre-emergent herbicides, whether it's too wet and they get leached from the soil, or it's too dry and they didn't get activated, or post herbicides. If it's too dry and those weeds are stressed, we won't see the same level of activity in any given year. And so in those years, having another layer of weed control and cover crops is really beneficial because it reduces the risk of a year where you see really high levels of failure in your weed control program. And the same goes for the cover crop. And so again, it's very much performance based. We need good, well-established stands that are uniform across the field that have produced a fair amount of biomass to be effective from a weed suppression standpoint. And regardless of whether we've used all the best management practices, weather is really going to dictate that from year to year. And so integrating, a two-pass herbicide program and cover crops is a way to reduce the risk of failures in the future. Okay, so just to finish up there, can we use cover crops to reduce herbicide inputs? Well, our data suggests that there's the potential when you have a well-performing cover crop to substitute that for a pre-emergent herbicide pass. So you could take a pass out of your program to save some money. So as long as that cover crop allows you to be on time and on target. There's also the opportunity to reduce the number of active ingredients that you have in your herbicide programs, and specifically probably those pre-emergent programs. But to do that, you have to have some level of the weed control spectrum, how effective your cover crops are on the suite of weed species you have within your weed community. And then finally, just thinking about adding cover crops to kind of that strong foundational two-pass herbicide program is going to create some redundancy and reduce risk of weed control failures, and that may allow you to kind of maintain a sustainable weed management program into the future. So that's all I had for you today. I hope we have time for questions. I really meant for this to be kind of a primer, kind of a big picture talk, and I'm sure that you'll learn even more tomorrow in tomorrow's session. So thank you.
Thank you, John. A lot of great information there about pre and post herbicide applications and how that ties into the use of cover crops. I really appreciate some of those visuals that you had. We had a question come in through the chat to kick things off. And that question is, have you done no herbicide versus a one or a two pass program comparison?
Yeah, well, I would say that we typically don't have a no herbicide comparison. However, I have a fair amount of experience trying to utilize the same approach in organic systems, where we would just use a roller crimper as a mechanical means for terminating the cover crop, and then relying on that cover crop as really our primary means of weed suppression. And so, what we know about kind of a zero herbicide program from that work is that one, our threshold, biomass threshold that we really need to get is considerably higher than a conventional system where we're asking the cover crop to do some of the work, but then we're integrating that with herbicide programs. Um, and so that's a challenge because we are not water limited, we're not nutrient limited in Pennsylvania or the Mid-Atlantic, we're growing degree day limited. And so the challenge is fitting and finding windows where you can establish a cover crop to generate a lot of biomass to make that system work. And so I think that would be the challenge in a conventional system where in those systems, we're trying to plant cash crops earlier and earlier. And so I don't think that in most systems we would be able to achieve enough biomass to get season-long weed suppression.
Very helpful. Another question we had come in is how much vetch and rye biomass did you have in the pigweed study? And do you have an approximate idea of the legume to grass composition of that mixture?
Yeah, so that if I it's been a while, and I'm sorry I should have had the numbers there. Yeah, across those 2 years, I think one year we had about 3,500 pounds of dry matter biomass, and the next year about 5,500. So on average, about 2 tons or 4,000 pounds of dry matter biomass, and that's um, in our system in the Mid-Atlantic. If you plant cover crops, if you can get your grain crops off sometime in October and get those cover crops established uh, in October, and we're terminating near kind of county averages for cash crop planting dates, that's about the maximum amount of biomass that we can produce. So to produce more, we would have to make some adjustment in the crop rotation. We either need to delay termination, and we've done a lot of that work more recently with planting green. So that study I shared, we were killing that cover crop 10 days prior to planting. And so those 10 or 14 days that you can make up by using planting green practices can increase the amount of biomass. The second part of the question, it was much more weighted to cereal rye than hairy vetch in that study. And that's despite the fact that we planted 30 pounds of hairy vetch and 30 pounds of cereal rye. So if when we're trying to have a larger component of legumes, we really back off our cereal rye seeding rates. But what studies have showed is what really drives the composition of those legume grass mixtures is soil residual fertility. And so if there's a lot of soil residual nitrogen there in the fall, that cereal rye is going to really take off and suppress hairy vetch in that type of scenario. And I think that's why we saw that in that particular study.
And touching on the soil residual a bit, another question that came in from Riley is on the herbicide recovery side, Zydua and atrazine have the highest level recovered. Does this mean more active ingredient got stuck on the residue or more reached the soil to be effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a whole hour-long talk, and I just wanted to raise that question because it's something that we're learning more about. But specifically, the reason why Zidua and atrazine we measured higher wash off relative to those other herbicides is it has to do with the properties of the herbicide and how readily they adsorb or absorb into plant tissues. And so those herbicides are kind of moderately lipophilic, which is kind of the properties that we're looking for in a herbicide that would maximize its wash-off potential. So much more lipophilic uh, herbicides tend to be less water soluble and absorb more tightly to plant residues, or in a planting green situation would move through that plant cuticle and get trapped, or a more water soluble herbicide can get entrapped in cell walls, or in a planting green situation get moved into the plant and translocated. So it's fairly the primary there's two considerations. There's the herbicide properties themselves, and then there's the properties of the residues. One is it still living in a planting green situation where we might be applying those herbicides at the time of burn down, or at what stage of decomposition that residue is. And the stage of decomposition is really going to determine how readily those herbicides absorb, or how tightly they absorb to the residues.
And we've got some really good questions coming in. Thank you all for those. Another one that we have is a bit descriptive. I'll read this out loud. We have many challenges with water hemp that is resistant to multiple modes of action, up to 6. So some populations are extremely limited in post products that would be effective on water hemp. What kind of a benefit are you seeing from using a cover crop, even when you use a strong pre-program?
Yeah, well, I think in those cases, you absolutely, it's that last point I tried to make, that we want to use cover crops in those types of systems to preserve the effective sites of action that we have left. And if we're dealing with 6-way resistant populations, we don't have that many sites of action left. And so specifically, let's say that water hemp population we still have, let's say 2,4-D and glufosinate activity. Um, what we think one of the benefits is, when we force water hemp to grow through surface mulch, um, it produces a plant that's etiolated, or it has a long skinny shoot. And if we compare that to a water hemp that's emerged in no residue, it will, even if we're talking about two water hemp plants that are both 6 inches tall, um, the 6-inch tall water hemp plant that emerged in the absence of cover crop residue will have many more growing points. So it'll be kind of branchier, more leaves, where the water hemp plant that is emerged through cover crop residues will have fewer growing points, because it had to spend its energy on getting out of that surface mulch, right? So we'll have fewer leaves. So if we came in with a post application of glufosinate, a contact herbicide, where coverage is key, our field studies suggest that we're going to be more effective and get higher levels of control in the cover crop system, because we're targeting plants with fewer growing points. Does that make sense? So you can think about kind of cover crops almost working synergistically with those post herbicides, because we're more effective due to the way that we've changed the growth behavior of water hemp in that system.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And those last couple of images you shared really show that picture, the difference between the above ground and below ground biomass coming through that cover crop mulch layer. Another question that came in from Stephanie, looking for more details on the biomass affecting small seeded weed species. Do you see more of the small seeds not even germinating, or weak growing seedlings that either die or grow out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's hard to measure in the field. Often we go out there and we apply some cover crop treatments, and we count weeds that are up, right? And so we don't know whether the weeds that we're not seeing never got out of the soil and are there, and maybe are going to contribute to the problem next year because they just didn't germinate this year. Or they did germinate but didn't make it. We call it, it's the seedling mortality, right? Um, and I think it's the combination of both. So studies suggest that you have to have really pretty high levels of cover crop surface mulch to prevent or to stop germination that's triggered by light. Typically, there's still enough light that gets through cover crop surface residues for that not to be a limiting factor. And light is, with those small seeded species like water hemp, is often needed. It's a species that needs that it's light sensitive. Um, so in some cases, we may have enough biomass, or if that water hemp is partially buried in the soil and also has kind of soil preventing light from getting into the canopy or to where the weeds are, we may see a reduction in germination. But I think based on our work that a fair amount of the reduced recruitment populations that we see is due to weeds that germinated and then didn't survive. And so that is in, from a long-term standpoint is would be the best outcome because we've removed those weeds from the seed bank, right? I think keeping them in the seed bank is still a positive effect because the longer they stay in the seed bank, the greater the potential for them to succumb to disease or some other kind of mortality in the soil. So I think that was a long way to say that the answer I think is both. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Lots to learn still, but making really good headway. Now, another question is have what does the soil temperature in the spring, what have you noticed when it comes to increasing the cover crop biomass? I know you're out of Pennsylvania, but have you seen the cover crop affecting soil temperature? And has that had an effect on the cash crop planting timing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, so in general, the longer we leave that cover crop grow in the spring, it will keep the upper soil surface cooler than if we would have had no cover crop or if we would have killed that cover crop earlier. Um, it can be up to a couple degrees difference, depending on the year. Um, and so that can, if you're not going to stick soybeans in the ground until you hit 55 degrees, at the 2-inch depth, that could influence the ideal planting window for your cash crop. If it's going to do anything, it's going to push that back. Um, from a weed standpoint, those cooler soil temperatures likely help to delay weed seedling recruitment. The other thing that we see is that the amplitude of soil temperatures becomes more moderated, so we don't have as high of highs and low of lows in the cover crop compared to no cover crop where we see it warm up a lot more during the day and then cool down. So there's a greater fluctuation in temperatures. And greater fluctuation in temperatures or kind of the change or amplitude in those temperatures is another way in which is another trigger for weed germination. So those two factors, kind of the reduction in soil temperature on average, and then and a reduction in the amplitude in soil temperature are two reasons why we might see later recruitment of weeds in cover crops. Um, the soybean, mostly we've focused on soybeans, and we've done a lot in the past, I would say 4 to 5 years, looking at kind of the planting date and cover crop management termination timing effect on soybean yield and whether those kind of reduced temperatures. Sometimes we're planting into drier conditions because if we allow the cover crop to continue to grow, it's going to continue to pull soil moisture out. and we may kind of, which is great in a wet year, but you can also get too dry and really prevent good planting conditions in some cases. And what our work there has found is that, you know, unless you've gotten so dry that you don't see soybeans, they don't have enough moisture to germinate, and you see a reduced stand or they don't come up for 2 or 3 weeks. Um, if it's not that extreme, we tend not to see any effects on soybean yields. And if anything, we've seen some kind of positive benefits of that surface mulch um, conserving soil moisture later in the season closer to pod fill. And so when you're making yield, we think it's really the soil moisture dynamics that are occurring later in the season that influence yield potential.
That's a great tie-in to some webinar conversations we've had previously about soil moisture and the benefits there. And just to wrap things up, really appreciate your time and insight. I have colleagues that are working on developing an app that can help determine cover crop biomass. Still work in progress there, but wondering if you have any final thoughts about how someone might evaluate the cover crop biomass in their field and determining that as a good pre-herbicide control replacement.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's some simple ways to do it. Um, Based on measuring the height of the cover crop and kind of, somebody could go out and just take a handful of counts and that kind of stuff that we can um, get fairly close to what that biomass range is. We're getting closer and closer to being able to do that with proximal sensing equipment, right? Whether that's a drone or cameras mounted on a sprayer, that technology is getting much, much closer. Um, but as far as relating that to a biomass threshold needed for weed suppression, we talk about that frequently, and I'm not sure that that's the best way to think about it. There's probably a minimum threshold that we need to get across to where we see cover crops benefiting our weed management programs. We have seen in some cases where if we have a very little cover crop biomass, where we're not influencing germination cues or can't suppress weed seedlings, but we're changing that soil environment in a way in which it's actually a little more conducive for weed recruitment. And so that number is probably somewhere below 1,000 pounds or half a ton of dry matter per acre. But once we get past that, and if you're in knee-high cover crops that are well established and if the grasses are well tillered out, I think that there's going to be a benefit. And uh, and the decision or what we need to work on from kind of a weed management standpoint is to determine where the number is where we can remove pre-herbicides and just rely on a post program compared to where it makes sense to integrate the pre-herbicide with the cover crops, if that makes sense. And so I'm not sure that we're there yet. I don't know that there's a magic number for how much biomass we need. But I can tell you that there's lots of folks like myself that are trying to take what we're learning in the field and come up with a better, kind of simpler rule of thumb or decision support tool to be able to make those types of decisions.
Really exciting insights and looking forward to learning more. Thank you again, John. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Odine to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you all of you for tuning in today. This has been a great discussion, and we appreciate John taking the time to join us today. Be sure to check out Farmers for Soil Health, which you can learn more about in farmersforsoilhealth.com. and a short survey will pop up once this webinar concludes. We would greatly appreciate it if you could provide us with your feedback. For those of you wanting the CEU credit, now is a good time to open the CA app on your phone and be ready to scan the QR code by selecting Scan Course Code, which we will put in the screen shortly. Before that, as a reminder, today's session is a part of a two-part webinar series on strengthening your weed control program with cover crops. Today, we heard from Dr. John Wallace, part one, and tomorrow, Tuesday, January 13, at this same time, we're excited to welcome Dr. Anita Dill for part two. We hope you can join us again, and the registration will be the registration link is in the chat, I think, right now. There we go. Yeah, if we can go to the next slide. We're also excited to be partnering with Good Idea Shop Talks to offer 3 virtual farmer meetups on January 22nd, 29, and February 25th. The registration link is also in the chat and will be included in the follow-up email as well. Please keep a lookout for the follow-up email with the webinar recording and additional resources. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out or contact. Our contact info is in the next slide. Please. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll leave that there for a sec. If you want to write down, take a screenshot or a photo or something like that. And then the last, if we can go to the last slide, this is for those seeking CCA credits for this webinar. The information is on the screen now, so you can scan the QR code. Yep, it's right there. And scan the QR code on the screen through the CCA app on your mobile device by selecting Scan Course Code, or you can email Olivia using the contact information that is in the chat. I think Shanna will drop it in there in a sec. Thank you again, everyone. We'll hold here a little for a minute or so, so we make sure everyone got their credit. And really appreciate you being here. I hope we hope you join us tomorrow for our next webinar.